Under the vaulted ceilings of medieval France, pleasure was not a sin, it was a weapon. Philip IV, known to history as the Fair, ruled with a face carved in marble and a soul steeped in shadow. Behind the public image of a pious monarch lay a court drenched in secrecy, obsession, and ritualized seduction. The same man who burned the Knights Templar alive also held feasts where virtue was mocked and vows were broken. His court became a theatre of temptation, where men traded loyalty for touch and women for favor. In the torchlight of the Louvre, silk veils concealed power plays more ruthless than any battlefield. Young courtiers learned that submission could be as useful as a sword, and pleasure could buy survival. The Queen's ladies, chosen for beauty and discretion, were often commanded to entertain more than conversation. The air stank of incense, sweat, and fear, a holy court masking unholy desires. Priests whispered prayers in the morning, but by night, even they were invited to dine with sin. In a single evening, the same table might host bishops, mistresses, and condemned men seeking last redemption. Philip's obsession was not lust, it was dominion, the need to control everybody under his crown. He studied people like pawns, knowing where to place a smile or a scandal to shift power. Foreign ambassadors spoke of his divine calm, unaware it hid a storm of erotic manipulation. Behind closed doors, oaths of fealty were sealed, not with ink, but with flesh and humiliation. Every gesture in his court carried double meaning. One for the church, one for the shadows. To the outside world, France seemed radiant with piety, a jewel of Christian virtue. But inside the royal chambers, that jewel was cracked, reflecting forbidden acts the clergy dared not name. The royal bed became a stage, and every lover a potential spy, confessor, or executioner. Some said Philip's coldness in public was born from excess in private, a man drained by his own games. Others whispered that he believed indulgence could purify the soul if hidden behind royal blood. The truth, however, was darker than either sin or sanctity. It was strategy masquerading as desire. Every forbidden act was recorded in rumor, every rumor turned into leverage. And as France knelt before its king, few knew it was not faith holding them. It was fear. Because in the kingdom of Philip the Fair, virtue was a mask and pleasure was law. In Philip's world, desire was not a weakness, it was a language of command. He understood that control over hearts and bodies was far more enduring than rule by sword. The church taught abstinence, yet the king practiced domination through indulgence. Each forbidden liaison, each whispered invitation, became another string in his web of obedience. When he wanted loyalty, he offered intimacy. When he wanted silence, he offered shame. In a time when women were traded like land, Philip weaponized affection until it became currency. He surrounded himself with courtiers who would betray their conscience for a touch, a glance, a night. His mistresses were not lovers. They were mirrors reflecting his power back to him. He chose them young, intelligent, and fearful, trained to please but never to question. Those who resisted his attention often found themselves accused of witchcraft, heresy, or moral corruption. Desire in Philip's court was a battlefield where survival demanded surrender. Men of the cloth who condemned lust in sermons found themselves drawn to it in private confession. Philip used their guilt as chains, tightening them with every sin they denied. Even his sons were not immune to the lesson. The crown was to be ruled through pleasure and secrecy. It was said that the young princes watched, as their father humiliated noblemen through seduction's theatre. A smile from the king could elevate a family, but a rumor of disfavor could destroy it overnight. He learned to read desire the way others read scripture, searching for devotion hidden behind fear. Courtiers began to mimic him, blending charm with cruelty, lust with politics. The palace became a marketplace of temptation, where favors were traded like relics. Marriage meant nothing. Fidelity was a tool of control, not love. The queen, Joan of Navarre, was both ornament and shield, her chastity displayed to hide his excess. Philip's sense of morality twisted until domination felt divine, and obedience felt holy. He saw the human body as both confession and contract, every touch binding, every gaze dangerous. Beneath the gold and incense, the French court functioned like a cult, its rituals erotic, its faith power, and at the center of it all stood a king who believed that to own someone's body was to own their soul. It began with a whisper carried through the marble halls of the Louvre. 3 queens accused of betraying France, Margaret, Blanche, and Joan, the wives of Philip's sons, were said to have defiled the royal bloodline. The rumor claimed they met their lovers in a fortress called the Tour de Nesle under the cloak of midnight. 2 knights, the Donné brothers, were accused of being their secret companions in lust and treason. The discovery, historians say, began not with spies, but with suspicion. Philip's daughter Isabella, sowing doubt across the Channel. She had married England's Edward II, and from her cold marriage grew a thirst for revenge and power. When she returned to France, she told her father that his daughters-in-law mocked their husbands through infidelity. Philip, a man who mastered secrecy, could not bear being deceived by his own bloodline. He ordered an investigation so silent it could have been mistaken for a prayer. Servants disappeared overnight, guards were replaced, and interrogations were whispered through keyholes. Soon, under torture, one maid confessed to smuggling love tokens to the knights on behalf of the queens. The scandal exploded. An act of adultery turned into an accusation of treason against the crown. For Philip, it was not just betrayal of love, it was rebellion within his own dynasty. The Donné brothers were captured, stripped, and dragged into the courtyard of Pontoise. Their confessions were forced through agony, their flesh torn to satisfy royal outrage. They were flayed alive, their genitals cut off, their bodies broken before the watching nobles. The message was clear. Passion without permission was treason, and treason demanded spectacle. Margaret, the eldest daughter-in-law, was imprisoned in a tower, her golden hair shorn in disgrace. She screamed her innocence to deaf walls, until the air itself seemed to turn against her. Blanche met the same fate, confined to darkness, her beauty fading into memory and mildew. Joan, the third, was spared, perhaps because her husband, the future Philip V, needed legitimacy more than justice. Across France, nobles whispered that the king had staged the scandal to purge his court of rival bloodlines. Others claimed he used the incident to remind his sons that love was dangerous and women were tools. The Tour de Nesle affair became the most infamous scandal of medieval Europe, echoing through chronicles and curses alike. It shattered the illusion of divine purity that cloaked the Capetian dynasty. Behind the execution pyres and confessions, there was something more insidious. Philip's hunger to reassert control through humiliation. He turned sin into theatre, desire into execution, and love into evidence of rebellion. By the end, the line between justice and vengeance had vanished, swallowed by the fire of royal shame. And though the bodies were burned and the names erased, the stench of that scandal clung to France for generations. The court of Philip IV was a labyrinth where politics and passion were indistinguishable from poison. Every secret encounter had a purpose, every kiss carried consequence, and every silence could buy survival. Philip turned seduction into a form of espionage, planting temptation where loyalty was uncertain. He knew that a courtier who sinned was easier to control than one who prayed. Mistresses were assigned like missions, their beauty serving as both trap and testimony. Through them, he extracted confessions, alliances, and betrayals whispered in the dark. The king's agents would slip into bedrooms rather than battlefields, collecting secrets from tangled sheets. A single knight's indulgence could decide the fate of an entire province. Even bishops and cardinals found themselves drawn into the orbit of royal pleasure and corruption. A priest who once condemned lust now served as confessor to the king's mistresses, sanctifying sin. Rumors claimed that certain clerics were rewarded with gold and absolution for silence. The papal court, far in Avignon, grew restless with France's moral decay, yet none dared confront him. Philip had already humbled the Pope once. Dragging him from power to prove divine authority could be bent. If he could dethrone God's servant, what man or woman could defy his will in bed? His power was absolute, but its roots were tangled in intimacy and fear. He orchestrated marriages not for love but for leverage, binding families through lust disguised as duty. Every affair, real or invented, could be weaponized to destroy an enemy or elevate a friend. Some nobles attempted to use seduction against him, sending their daughters to catch his favor. But Philip's heart was impenetrable. He desired control, not affection. He would reward the obedient and ruin those who mistook pleasure for power. One countess, who tried to manipulate him with charm, found her husband executed on charges of heresy. No scandal escaped his design. No sin was beyond exploitation. He ruled through restraint in public and indulgence in private, creating the illusion of divine purity. Foreign courts were captivated and terrified, calling him the Marble King, a beautiful, cold, and unyielding. When the Tour de Nesle scandal erupted, Philip used it not to cleanse his court but to consolidate it. The Queen's downfall allowed him to purge rivals and fill the vacuum with those loyal only to him. Every public punishment served as a warning. Pleasure belongs to the crown, not to the people. By intertwining politics with sexuality, Philip redefined monarchy itself, not as divine service, but as total possession. Those who dined with him learned that the sweetest wine could hide the deadliest command. And in the grand game of France, love was not a gift, it was a leash. Outside the gilded walls of the Louvre, the people whispered of their king's purity, but dreamed of his sins. The peasants, bound to the land and the church, could only imagine what blasphemies occurred behind marble doors. For them, pleasure was a sin punished in confession. For nobles, it was a ritual of privilege. Women in villages were forced to hide their beauty, while noble women were praised for flaunting theirs. The double standard became law, modesty for the poor, temptation for the powerful. In the cities, brothels flourished under royal taxes, each coin a quiet confession of hypocrisy. Priests preached chastity on Sundays, then sought absolution in the arms of paid comfort by nightfall. The people saw their ruler burn heretics for impurity while hosting feasts where sin was entertainment. It bred confusion, a moral dissonance that blurred the line between sacred and profane. Marriage among the peasants was survival. Marriage among the nobility was negotiation. A farmer's wife was owned by labor. A count's wife was owned by alliance. Even the church could not untangle its own complicity, blessing unions built on deceit and dominance. Behind every sermon about virtue lay an unspoken understanding that sin kept the crown strong. Young men entering service at court learned quickly that charm mattered more than prayer. They polished words instead of armor, eyes trained to read the gestures of the powerful. Servant girls carried rumors like relics, earning coin for each truth and more for each lie. In marketplaces, minstrels sang ballads of secret chambers and punished queens, half-truths dressed as history. The scandal of the Tour de Nesle became folklore, passed from lips to lips as both warning and thrill. Parents frightened their daughters with tales of queens who loved too freely and paid with their lives. The church tried to erase the memory, but the people remembered. Their king's holiness was performance. Even the art of the age began to shift. Painters and poets hinted at corruption beneath divine imagery. Statues of angels bore the faces of courtesans, and sermons used royal sin as proof of humanity's fall. Among the lower classes, resentment festered. Virtue was demanded of them, yet denied to those in power. The royal court's indulgence widened the gap between heaven's promise and earth's cruelty. In taverns, drunk men cursed the holy hypocrites who lived on the taxes of their hunger, but none dared speak the king's name aloud, for even rumours of mockery could end on the gallows. The shadow of Philip's court reached every hearth, shaping how France understood power and desire. It taught that pleasure was not freedom, it was ownership disguised as joy. And in time, the people of France would remember that lesson when crowns began to fall. The turning point came not through rebellion, but through rot, moral, spiritual, and physical. Philip's control, once absolute, began to crumble under the weight of his own manipulations. The court that once trembled before him now whispered behind his back. The Tour de Nesle scandal had cleansed no sin, it had only exposed the filth beneath the crown. Those who had served him through desire began to fear him through disgust. Even the clergy, long complicit, started to question whether divine favor still followed the king. The Pope's envoys returned with warnings cloaked as blessings, their smiles trembling under the tension of hypocrisy. Philip's enemies multiplied not by sword, but by conscience. His sons, raised in his shadow, had learned only how to mistrust and exploit. Their marriages, ruined by his punishments, bore no love and no stability. The Capetian dynasty, once the pride of Christian Europe, began to fracture from within. The public saw famine, plague, and punishment as omens of divine wrath upon a sinful court. Nobles fled to monasteries, seeking forgiveness that power could no longer purchase. Philip's own health began to decline, his once perfect composure replaced by trembling hands and sleepless nights. He saw ghosts in mirrors, heard whispers in prayers, and dreamed of burning towers filled with laughter. Chroniclers wrote that he became haunted by the faces of those he destroyed. Some claimed the spirits of the Dornay brothers visited him in fevered dreams, their eyes hollow with accusation. Others said the Virgin herself turned her face from France, leaving the kingdom to its own decay. The king who had ruled through fear now feared his own reflection. When he looked at his sons, he saw not heirs, but the cursed fruit of his own design. The once proud knights of France murmured that God had withdrawn his grace from their monarch. When lightning struck the cathedral at Saint-Denis, many believed heaven had spoken its verdict. Philip tried to tighten his control, issuing decrees against corruption while his court drowned in it. Every attempt to restore order only revealed how deep the rot had spread. Confessions once whispered now became weapons. Everyone sought redemption by betraying someone else. Servants poisoned masters, priests denounced bishops, and lovers exposed each other to save their souls. The monarchy's strength, built on secrecy, collapsed under the flood of truth. By the final years of his reign, Philip was a man trapped in the machinery of his own making. He had conquered desire, but lost devotion, ruled men's bodies but destroyed their faith, and when his death came suddenly, after a fall from his horse, France did not mourn. The people said the devil had simply come to collect what was his. Philip's death did not end his sins. It multiplied them. The rot he nurtured in secret spread through France like an invisible plague. His sons inherited the throne, but none of his cunning. Only his curse. Each ruled briefly, each died mysteriously, leaving behind chaos and doubt. The once mighty Capetian line, which had reigned for centuries, dissolved within a generation. It was as if divine punishment had marked the blood of Philip the Fair chroniclers called it la malédiction du roi, the curse of the king. They whispered that God had avenged the innocent through the slow destruction of Philip's dynasty. The Templars he burned, the mistresses he broke, the wives he condemned, all seemed to rise from the ashes. Within 14 years of his death, every one of his male heirs was dead or disgraced. France, once united under his control, fractured into greed, suspicion, and rebellion. His moral tyranny had stripped the court of conscience. His cruelty had stripped the people of faith. The Tour-de-Nesle scandal remained a wound in French memory, retold by monks as divine warning. Even centuries later, chroniclers could not separate the king's political brilliance from his moral corruption. The French church, humiliated by its silence, tightened its grip on morality, preaching purity with new ferocity. But the harder they preached, the more the people remembered the hypocrisy of the crown. Philip's manipulation of desire had destroyed the sacred trust between ruler and ruled. In time, that mistrust would ignite revolutions and guillotines, born from the shadow of his reign. The art of seduction he weaponized became a symbol of tyranny itself. Pleasure as oppression, virtue as performance. Writers in later centuries portrayed him as the architect of moral decay disguised as divine authority. His reign became the blueprint for how power corrupts when it claims to serve holiness. Archaeological records show few relics of his private chambers. Most were destroyed, erased, or sealed by successors. Yet the silence of those missing artifacts speaks louder than preservation ever could. Chroniclers' accounts, often censored by the church, still describe hidden tunnels beneath the Louvre. They wrote of masked gatherings, ritualized confessions, and punishments that blurred the line between faith and desire. Whether myth or truth, these stories reflect the shadow Philip left on Europe's imagination. His fall became a lesson whispered across generations. A king can rule nations, but not temptation. Even today, historians debate whether his scandals were exaggerations or evidence of a deeper sickness of power. But one fact endures: his pursuit of control through lust destroyed the very legacy he sought to immortalize. He died believing himself chosen by God. Yet history remembers him as the man who provoked him. And from that collision of sanctity and sin, France inherited both a crown and a curse. Centuries have passed, yet the story of Philip IV still feels unsettlingly familiar. Power still hides behind virtue, and corruption still wears the mask of piety. The same mechanisms that ruled his court, temptation, fear, secrecy, govern the modern corridors of influence. His palace of whispers has become the boardroom, the parliament, the hidden network of privilege. The instruments have changed, but the melody of manipulation remains the same. Philip understood that the human heart is the most obedient servant when ruled by desire. Today, his lesson echoes through scandals that topple governments and expose false prophets. We call it abuse of power. He called it divine right. The language of seduction has merely evolved into persuasion, branding, and psychological control. Modern leaders, like Philip, often preach morality while feasting on the very vices they condemn. His legacy survives not in monuments, but in the recurring cycles of hypocrisy that define civilization. Every age creates its own version of the royal court, digital, political, or spiritual, and in each, we find the same dance between sanctity and sin, purity and performance. The story of Philip IV reminds us that lust for control always disguises itself as righteousness. He mastered the art of appearing holy while feeding on corruption, and humanity has never stopped applauding that illusion. We remember him as a king, but his reflection is in every system that trades integrity for influence. The same hunger that destroyed his dynasty now fuels empires built on image and deception. It is the quiet truth history keeps repeating, that the forbidden never dies, it only changes its costume. When we look at the scandals of today, we are not seeing something new. We are merely watching the same theatre that played in the halls of medieval France. His story is a mirror held to our time, daring us to recognize our own reflection. And so, centuries later, the question remains, how far would you go to feel powerful? Because in every age there are Philips, and there are those who serve them. The names change, but the desire to dominate through desire never does. The real horror is not that Philip ruled this way, it's that the world still does. And somewhere, in every generation, another king learns to rule through sin and call it virtue.